Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Gaspard, the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Welcome to CAP. We have a full house here and so many folks are online. One would think that, maybe there's someone special in this building today. 15 years ago tomorrow, the stock market crashed. More than 6 million Americans lost their homes in foreclosure. The average household lost a third of their net worth. Home prices plummeted while unemployment skyrocketed. Wall Street's ungoverned recklessness became the pain and heartache of America. This occurred in a period when I was out on the hustings, on the campaign trail with then candidate Barack Obama. As he was confronted by the pain, the sense of deep betrayal of folks in Ohio and Virginia, Florida, throughout the country, who really felt fundamentally deceived. Many of their loans and mortgages were predatory. Big banks had bet their hard-earned wages and lost. The financial institutions basically wreaked havoc in the lives of these hardworking Americans, while government was asleep at the switch. Fresh off of that 2008 election, with the voters' mandate in hand, we knew that something had to be done, not merely to dig us out of a massive economic hole, but to put an architecture in place to ensure that working people would not be bamboozled and made vulnerable again. In one of the finest decisions of his career, President Obama chose to lean on a Harvard law professor named Elizabeth Warren. You might have heard of her, to help us deliver on that mandate. And of course, she did not let him down. She protected millions of Americans from corporate abuse and certain economic calamity. She set a new legal and moral standard. In establishing that standard, Senator Warren proposed, advocated for, and helped construct the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She poured the foundation, thatched the roof, and fixed the plumbing. The CFPB immediately filled a gaping need, the need for a federal institution that championed ordinary Americans instead of big business. In its 12-year history, the agency has returned a whopping $17.5 billion to exploited consumers. Its mission is explicitly non-political and pretty darn straightforward: protect everyday Americans from getting hosed. The agency's independence is the reason why it's been so effective, because the need for consumer safeguarding does not ebb and flow with political tides, and neither does the CFPB by Congress's design. Now, a court case brought by a trade group of exploitative payday lenders threatens to curb that autonomy. The Supreme Court will review the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decision, which flouted precedents and used a novel, some might say strange, interpretation of the Appropriations Clause to find the funding and rulemaking of the agency unconstitutional. Consumers are at severe risk here. If this decision is upheld, all of the progress that we've made will take a massive step backwards. So we're joined today by somebody who has an allergic reaction to backwards, who only knows how to take huge progressive steps forward. Senator Warren has been fighting for everyday Americans her entire professional career. Her name has become synonymous with economic inclusion, equal opportunity, and unrivaled persistence. No one is better at holding power to account and helping to build power alongside all who are in the good fight, like the determined men and women of the United Auto Workers who are on the picket line today, and who, of course, we all stand in solid solidarity with. Senator Warren came from one of those humble places in our nation, from a struggling family, and became the first member of that family to graduate from college and from law school, and became a leading light in legal scholarship. But she recognized, of course, that scholarship has no bite without advocacy. So she did a thing that so many of us were hoping she'd do. In 2012, she decided to throw her hat in the ring and become a candidate for office. And of course, she became not only successful in that endeavor, but made a little bit of history in Massachusetts by becoming the first woman to represent that state in the United States Senate. So Senator Warren has fought to curb costs, to build access to higher education, for affordable housing in this country. She works day in and day out restlessly to mitigate climate change, to fight for against income inequality, and to stand as a safeguard against corporate overreach. We are always proud to be able to welcome one of the most important champions for working people in America to a CAP stage. Senator Warren, the House is yours.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Patrick. CAP is so lucky to have a leader like Patrick. Thank you. Thank you. And hello, Center for American Progress. It is so good to be here today, to be able to talk with you about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or as I like to call it, the little agency that could. It has been 13 years since President Obama signed the Dodd-Frank Act into law and created the CFPB. So that means that this little agency is now a teenager, and that makes it a whole lot younger than most of the other federal agencies. Even so, memories in DC can be short. And even though Patrick covered this in a general sense, I think it's worthwhile to recall what consumer protection looked like before we had the CFPB. So before Dodd-Frank came along, consumer protection laws were piecemeal, with responsibilities split up among more than half a dozen agencies. And because consumer protection was no one's first job, it meant no one took responsibility. Enforcing rules was always somebody else's job. There was no cop on the beat looking out for the American consumer, and the big banks liked it that way. After making billions of dollars scamming customers, the mortgage finance industry imploded with the crash of Lehman Brothers, followed by the failure of literally hundreds of other banks. But even as they stood among the ruins that they had caused, the banks lobbied ferociously against the idea of a consumer agency. It is true that there is no shame in this group. They know that they have a right to get out there and fight for their profits. But those big banks picked a fight with the wrong crowd, including some of you who are here today. We made the case that the big banks could not be trusted to police themselves, and we won. So since its founding, that little agency has handled nearly 4 million consumer complaints. In fact, as Patrick was pointing out, CFPB has forced financial companies to return over $17 billion directly to the Americans they cheated. Service members, veterans, seniors, students, and millions of regular families have gotten help from the CFPB. And for families on a budget, getting your money back is a very big deal. The CFPB is the cop on the beat for the finances of America's families. It handles more than 3,000 complaints every single day, day in and day out. And it reminds every lender that if they cheat, there is a serious chance that they could get caught. The CFPB does something else that's important. It makes markets work better. The CFPB promotes stability in the economy by laying out clear rules of the road. Look at the qualified mortgage rule. Let's be dorky for just a minute here. Okay, qualified mortgage rule. By requiring mortgage issuers to ensure that borrowers can actually repay their loans, the rule directly addressed the underlying cause of the 2008 financial crisis. And it rebuilt a mortgage market that both homeowners and investors can trust. The rule ended the bank's get-rich-quick subprime mortgage lending, and now more people can make lasting investments in housing, building their own financial security over time. CFPB also weeds out cheaters, and it punishes repeat rule breakers. And because of that, it helps level the playing fields for companies that actually want to play by the rules. In short, the CFPB helps make markets work more efficiently, and it helps build a stronger American economy. But here's the truth. A handful of powerful financial companies don't want a level playing field. They've built business models on being able to cheat some of their customers. And if the bank's cheating wrecks families or destroys our economy, they really don't care. These companies did not want the CFPB in the first place, and they have never stopped fighting to take it down. And they want to return us to a time when they could profit from deceiving their customers. Among the lenders who make their profits by trapping their customers are payday lenders. Payday lenders are notorious for preying on service members and charging interest and fees that go to 400% and higher. They have fought off regulation by the CFPB, bringing and losing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. Since the agency was formed, payday lenders have spent more than $60 million lobbying to try to loosen those rules. And now they're throwing a Hail Mary pass to try to stop the CFPB in its efforts to protect soldiers and sailors and communities of color and others who fall into the payday lenders' traps. In just a few days, a case that was constructed and funded by the payday lenders will be before the Supreme Court. The payday lenders claim that the CFPB is unconstitutional because Congress chose to fund it through the Federal Reserve rather than through annual appropriations by Congress. The Fifth Circuit sided with those lenders, saying Congress can't fund the Bureau that way. Now, the Fifth Circuit's decision is radical. Radical because none of the federal banking regulators is funded through appropriations. Not the Fed, not the OCC, not the FDIC, not the FHFA, not the OTS, not NACUA, and not the CFPB. In fact, starting back in 1863, with our very first banking regulator, Congress decided to protect the integrity of these regulators from the chaos and the politicking of the annual appropriations process by giving them independent funding structures. There is no constitutional basis for requiring Congress to do otherwise. A few years ago, the then Supreme Court would have refused even to hear a case as ridiculous as this one. But we have a very different court now, and the stakes are much higher. The CFPB's future is at stake in this court decision, along with the future of every other banking regulator. And the possible fallout doesn't stop there. Social Security and Medicare are also operated outside the annual appropriations process. A bad decision in the Supreme Court could wreck the financial security of millions of families and turn our economy upside down. If Republicans control Congress, they could starve the CFPB of resources to neuter its ability to go after wrongdoing. And if the Supreme Court opens the door for them, the independence of the Fed, the FDIC, and others that use a funding model like the CFPB will evaporate. Instead of regulators that watch out for the safety and soundness of our economy, we'll have regulators who bow to the wishes of the most politically connected financial institutions. The CFPB is under attack because it's good at what it does. and the American people support it. The Biden administration has made the CFPB even better, ramping up efforts to protect consumers, curbing predatory practices, and leveling the playing field for the majority of businesses that want to abide by the rules. President Biden has focused hard on making government work for real people. He's made getting rid of junk fees a signature move of his administration. Just last week, Vice President Harris unveiled a new plan with the CFPB to ensure that people who get sick won't see their credit ruined over medical bills that are often riddled with mistakes and that don't predict credit worthiness. There is an extra dose of irony that this attack on the CFPB comes less than 48 hours away from a government shutdown. The financial regulators, all the financial regulators, from the Fed to the FDIC to the CFPB, are designed to function all the time. Even if Congress has a meltdown, it is critical that the Fed continue to set interest rates and ensure that banks have enough capital. It is critical that the FDIC continues to audit the bank's books and ensure customer accounts. And it is critical that the CFPB keeps mortgage approvals running and handles those thousands of complaints that flood in every day from consumers. House Republicans are producing enough chaos without taking the financial regulators off the field. Yeah, the payday lenders want to boost their profits by taking the cop off the beat. But we are not going to back down without a fight. For MAGA Republican lawmakers, pain is the point. Chaos is the point. Government that cannot work for the people is the point. So here's what we need to do in the coming days. First, we need to get the band back together. That is, we need to reassemble the new version of the coalition that beat the banks and founded the CFPB. We need the policy experts right here at CAP. We need the consumer advocacy organizations. We need the labor unions. We need the academics. It took all of us to get this agency off the ground, and it's going to take all of us to keep this agency going. That's number one. Number two, we need to get to work. Our biggest task, educating American consumers about the essential work that the CFPB does on their behalf. The CFPB's efforts are kitchen table issues, taking on junk fees, medical debt, student loans, and the list goes on. Because the Bureau's work is so far-reaching, there are plenty of allies to pull into the fight with us. So that's part two. And the final part, essential to our plan, is the CFPB is not up for sale. It will not be broken up and sold for parts as some kind of compromise, not on our watch. You know, when I was fighting to get the agency established in law, there were some who told me that we could have the agency. We could actually get this thing passed into law as long as we took away its independent regulatory authority and its enforcement power. Think about what that was. In other words, there was actually a move to have a pretend agency that would have a great name and effectively do nothing. Some of those voices were even from so-called friends who like to say that they were on the side of working families, but they showed up over and over and over for the big banks. I told those friends what I'll tell you right now. My first choice is a strong consumer agency that can get the job done. My second choice is no agency and plenty of blood and teeth left on the floor. Blood and teeth, because instead of backing down, we are ready to fight. And it's not going to be an easy fight. The banks have a powerful lobby, but the CFPB is government that works for people all across this country. And that makes it worth fighting for. We beat back the big financial institutions. We beat back the moneyed interests. And with all of us in the fight, we can do it again. So thank you all very much. Fight on. Thank you. And I want to first say an apology. We have got a great panel coming up. I had a chance to visit with them a little bit back in the green room, but there's a thing or two going on over at the Hill right now. So I'm going to have to go, but I'm going to watch this on video. So know that. I want to introduce Dr. Emily G., who is going to introduce the panel and who's going to get you started on a real discussion about what this means and what we need to do. So Emily, up to you. Good to see you. Thank you all. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Warren, for underscoring the gravity of what's at stake in this case. We're so grateful for your tireless work fighting for working families, growing the middle class, and also founding an institution dedicated to finding an agency that holds financial institutions accountable to us here in this room, us, the American people, and making sure that that agency can operate with independence. I want to welcome our panel to the stage for a conversation. We have today a illustrious panel of experts who can speak to the wide range of benefits that the CFPB provides in overseeing consumer protection. And we'll also be explaining the impacts of a Supreme Court decision next week that could find that its funding is unconstitutional. Seated next to me is Elise Hicks. She is Consumer Policy Counsel and the Coalition Manager at Americans for Financial Reform. Elise works on consumer protection issues, including student debt, predatory lending, and credit reporting. Prior to joining AFR, Elise worked as a staff attorney focused on consumer protection issues in the insurance industry and as a research attorney at Bloomberg. In the middle, we have Skye Perryman, who is a good friend of CAP. I'm very pleased to have her here. She's also president and CEO of Democracy Forward, where her work focuses on advancing democratic values, stopping abuses of power, and improving the well-being of people and communities. Skye has led Democracy Forward since June 2021. She returned to the organization where she was previously founding member of the litigation team. Skye is also a seasoned attorney, and she most recently served as the chief legal officer and general counsel of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, where she oversaw a broad portfolio and led a number of groundbreaking initiatives that enhance access and equity in healthcare. And last but not least, on the far side of the stage there is Mike Pierce, who's executive director and co-founder of the Student Borrower Protection Center, an organization aimed at reining in industry abuses, protecting borrowers' rights, and advancing racial and economic justice. Mike is a student loan subject matter expert. He previously held senior positions on the Hill and has firsthand experience at the CFPB. There, he led the agency's work related to student lending, servicing, debt collection, and oversight of for-profit colleges. As Deputy Assistant Director for the CFPB, he led day-to-day operations in the Bureau's Office of Students and Young Consumers. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Before I kick off the discussion up here, I want to tell the audience here, both online and here in the building, that we will be taking audience questions at the end of the hour. So please think of what you would like to ask our panel, and we will turn to those remarks after our discussion here. So panel, we just heard Elizabeth Warren talk about the critical role that CFPB has played over its 12 years and how this case before CFPB versus CFSA stands to threaten the successes and also capacity to move forward. Can you just share your reaction to Senator Warren's remarks and also tell the audience what stands out to you as things that we should pay attention to, both with the case as well as the potential aftermath? Elise, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, every answer to every question that you were going to ask me it was going to be what Elizabeth Warren said. Everything that she painted, the picture of consumer protection, the picture of big banks, and the inequality between the two is what's at stake with this case, and the potential fallout for a ruling that's not favorable to consumers is a chaotic marketplace, as she painted out. So again, what Elizabeth Warren said is the big picture of what we can look forward to if SCOTUS doesn't make the right decision.
Scary indeed, Sky.
I'll just say, I think there are broader implications here, not just for people and communities and their finances, which is critically important. And we heard Senator Warren say a lot on that, but for our democracy as a whole. I mean, we are now experiencing this, I think it's tomorrow, as Patrick said, the anniversary of the major financial crisis since the Great Depression. And for many of us that were beginning our careers or in our careers in that time, there were devastating consequences for many folks. It was, definitely disproportionately impacted blue collar workers, but it affected all sectors. And our government responded. And, it's hard to get things done in Washington, but the government responded with the creation of the CFPB. Congress responded with how it wanted it to be financed so that it could be an agency that could serve all people, even when there's gridlock in Washington, or even when there are unexpected things that might imperil other agencies. And what we now have is sort of a coalition of right-wing legal organizations and special interests that are now seeking to use the courts to roll that back. And so I think that there are broad implications, not just for what happens in this case and how the court decides it for consumers, but also for what this means for our government's ability to work for people and to really the separation of powers and what the role of the courts are in that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today, but I think it's very high stakes for people's pocketbooks and families, but also for our broader system of government as a whole.
That's a tough act to follow. I think the two things that jumped out at me from what Senator Warren said are the word radical and the word chaos. It is not just an issue that has two sides because two sides are willing to make an argument here. What you see is the financial industry digging deep outside of the bounds of what normally gets put in front of courts to advance a set of arguments that, as the senator mentioned, seem to run in the face of the way American government has worked back to the mid-1800s. And again, this is a court that's going to potentially receive those arguments favorably. There's been an open for business sign hanging out front of the court since the day the 6-3 majority took power. And case after case after case, we see big financial interests bring cases that would have been radical in normal times with a normal court. And it's because these cases are being invited in. Chaos is the other theme that I hooked onto, because that's certainly what's going to happen here if this court keeps inviting cases like this. Win or lose in this case, chaos is the world that we live in now. And I think it's incumbent on all of us that care about a functioning government to realize that this isn't normal, this isn't okay. And it's great to have Senator Warren remind us that chaos is really the recipe here.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to reflect a bit on what the role of the CFPB is. At least I'm going to start with you. I think the numbers speak for themselves to what a successful champion for consumers the CFPB has been. In fact, this morning, CAP released a series of fact sheets, state by state, that provide some facts on what the CFPB has done for consumers in all sorts of areas, from credit cards to mortgages to other things. Nationally, CFPB has obtained more than $17.5 billion in benefits for Americans, responded to more than 3 million consumer complaints, and helped nearly 200 million people. But behind each of these big numbers is a personal story. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a story that sticks out to you and how the CFPB has helped consumers.
So not one personal story, but I think this is a repetitive and collective story about people dealing with medical debt. And the senator did say that the CFPB did propose a rule to eliminate all medical debt off of credit reports. So last year, the CFPB gave guidance to remove a certain amount of credit of medical debt from credit reports over a threshold of $500. But they then found that this didn't help the people that they wanted to really help, low income and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, in a way that was substantial. So people of color and low income people were still dealing with not being able to buy a home or not being able to rent, not being able to buy a car. And so this is a story that is prevalent now more so than ever when we're still dealing with the ripple effects of a pandemic. People don't choose to be sick. They don't choose to be underinsured. So this rule really unburdens that for consumers. And I'm very, very excited that CFPB decided to take up this mantle to eliminate this burden from consumers.
Thanks. I think that's a great example, medical debt, of how the CFPB really is core to families' financial security and well-being. Mike, I wanted to ask you to talk about some other examples. You've had senior roles at the CFPB, enforcing a myriad of consumer finance laws, such as ones that protect borrowers and promote competition in the financial marketplace. How could this legal challenge, CFPB versus CFSA, challenge the agency's funding and also affect the ability to enforce these statutes in the day-to-day operations of the agency?
Thanks. So I think it's important to remember that the CFPB's independence is key to its operations. When we were first building the agency, we spent a lot of time thinking about how these rules and laws that this agency is tasked with administering fit into the broader economy. And that includes, setting very clear rules of the road for the mortgage market, as Senator Warren mentioned, but also making sure that there is independent oversight over working families as they're paying for college. Dodd-Frank didn't just create an agency responsible for administering these consumer financial laws. It set clear definitions for what a consumer financial product is and what a consumer financial service is. And it really sat at the kitchen table with working people and thought about how they use financial products. What happens without a CFPB? We go back to this era where consumer protection is fragmented, where it is nobody's primary job to wake up in the morning and think about how to protect working people from financial predators, whether that's on Wall Street or a storefront payday lender in their neighborhood. So we lose this cop on the beat, but we also lose the order that sits over top of the financial system. Chaos, again, is what's going to happen.
Thanks, Mike. And Scott, I want to ask you about the broader implications of this case, which I think are really troubling. As the senator mentioned, the CFPB is far from the only agency that does not directly receive its funding from the annual appropriations process. As she mentioned, other financial regulators, including the Fed, the FDIC, have independent funding, and then core programs like Social Security and Medicare also are not part of the annual appropriations, but rather permanent appropriations. So what are some of the ways that a broad ruling from SCOTUS could jeopardize the funding of these other critical government agencies and services outside CFPB?
Sure. Well, I'll say a few things. In addition to the agencies and that the senator mentioned, there's also, like you said, there's Social Security and Medicare, which she mentioned. Also, our team filed a brief on behalf of agricultural interests, the Farm Credit Administration. So there's a lot at stake here with respect to if the courts were to step in and say that Congress cannot legislate on this funding mechanism. I think there's two things. One is when people show you who they are, we need to believe them. And what we know is that while there's a lot of media out there trying to suggest this is just about the CFPB and, chaos may not result, and, it's sort of just about one agency or just about how Congress may have gotten it wrong under the Constitution in the wake of the second largest financial crisis, whatever. That really what we know about the groups that are behind this is that they will come for the next agency. And it doesn't matter whether it's the FDIC, it doesn't matter whether it's Social Security, it doesn't matter if it's agencies that help our agricultural sector. And so I think that is one of the things that we are watching for, is not just what happens in this case, but also what happens more broadly. I will say there's a lot of skepticism with this court, and I think we can understand that. There have been a diversity of interests that have weighed in at the Supreme Court court on behalf of many communities throughout this country, saying how detrimental and chaotic a decision, an unprecedented and truly radical decision would be. This is not a legal theory that you could go read about in, law journals for years and everybody's been talking. This is a really radical theory that was shopped around and has now made its way to the court. And so I do think that it's really important for those of you that are in this room and for those of you that have interactions with communities throughout the country that people continue to be very clear about where the stakes are and what justice should happen in this case.
Thanks, Scott. And I want to dig deeper into that part about what it means for everyday Americans. Elise, I'm going to ask you about this. You mentioned medical debt, which I think is the latest, one of the latest proposed rules, but actually part of a larger, very rigorous rulemaking agenda that the CFPB is pursuing under Director Rohit Chopra. As part of President Biden's commitment to rein in junk fees, CFPB has examined fees imposed by banks and credit card issuers, and also had a recent proposal to limit credit card late fees that could save Americans $9 billion per year. We know that these fees also disproportionately affect low-income households and people of color. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what these savings really mean for everyday Americans.
This is my favorite issue to talk about. So I just want to preface this question with saying that low income and people of color, I know that phrase is being thrown around and it is, thrown around a lot, but I don't want to make those two synonymous. What we're really talking about here is people whose wealth has been extracted by wealth extractors and the ripple effects of that. So I read this article in Yahoo Finance that stated that the number of credit card revolvers, exceeded the number of credit card transactors in a 4-year time span between 2018 and 2022. What happened in the middle of that? COVID. So now we see people paying for essential needs like groceries and paying bills with their credit cards. And this is disproportionately happening to those whose wealth have historically been extracted from them, that have not been able to, they live paycheck to paycheck. So essentially, you're going to use your credit card. And what the CFPB proposed is a rule that makes credit card late fees reasonable and proportional to what it costs banks and card issuers to do business. And they were charging consumers 5 times that amount. At the highest rate, a credit card late fee costs about $41 for an average consumer. So this essentially means rolling that back to $8, I get to keep more money in my pocket. I don't really have to depend on my credit cards to buy my groceries or pay my bills. So it allows consumers, especially consumers who are already struggling, to try to build wealth in other ways except for depending on credit cards and banks to get by from month to month.
Thank you. And speaking of things that are hanging in the balance and returning money to people's pockets, one thing that there's a lot of uncertainty around right now is student loan forgiveness. Mike, which I know is a passion of yours. You've spent much of your career promoting consumer protection in higher ed. The Supreme Court is going to weigh in on the constitutionality of the Bureau's funding next week. And in terms of timing, this means that it's coming, just a few months after it ruled on President Biden's plan for student loan forgiveness and struck it down. Can you say a little bit more about what our student loan borrowers are experiencing right now? What sort of anxiety might they have about the ability of the CFPB to ensure that all consumers are treated fairly?
So I think it's important to recognize the moment that we're in, not just on the heels of this really radical rewriting of higher education law to shut down student debt relief for everybody, but also right on the precipice of a government shutdown. We talked about CFPB's independence. Senator Warren told us about how CFPB is going to keep its lights on even when the government shuts down. Student loan borrowers are going to have to make payments on their student loans, including 20 million people whose debts were supposed to be canceled. Those payments are due right at the same time as the government's going to shut its doors if the House doesn't get it together. And the only thing that's going to be watching the student loan industry while all of this happens is an independent CFPB that has its own funding. So we are watching all of these different threads, this corporate fever dream, for lack of a better word, play out in real time in student loan borrowers' lives. If there is no CFPB, if this all happens again and student loan borrowers are asked to pay bills that they shouldn't owe, there won't be a cop on the beat watching out for them. And I think it really is important to like trace, not to be too conspiratorial, but to trace all of these threads back to the corporate money that flows through the legal system and flows through Congress that is pushing chaos. House Republicans pushed the student loan system to restart, even though student debt relief couldn't be delivered. Big financial interests pushed the student loan challenges that got all the way up to the Supreme Court and lost. And now here we are as the payday lobby is pushing to dismantle the only independent oversight over the student loan system.
Thanks, Guy. I have a question. Yeah, please go ahead.
I just would say also one of the concerning trends that we see with the groups that are involved in this attempt to use the courts to roll back the CFPB is not just our corporate special interests, which of course you see those throughout the briefing. You can go look at the docket, but we see lawyers that were involved in questioning the 2020 election and promoting the big lie. I mean, we see anti-democratic forces, not just the traditional sort of special interest corporate forces. We see those also at play in this effort to dismantle the CFPB. And I think that that is very important for these broader issues that we're flagging, which is fundamentally, this is about our government's ability to deliver for people and the role of courts in that, but the role of the government in that and the role of Congress in that. And what we're seeing here is a really radical legal theory for all the reasons people have outlined that has now made its way up to the court. And of course, we have to hope that there will be some balance on the court that will see and will reject this very baseless theory that so many people across a diversity of interests have urged it to reject.
Thanks, Guy. And as we've been talking about the ramifications for consumer protection, but I think one thing that's very concerning about this case is it's a direct affront to Congress's express intent to create an independent agency that would protect consumers. Can you say a little bit more about the dangers of judicial policymaking, which is part of what's going on in this case?
Right. I mean, so that's the piece of this. And I mean, look, this is not the type of legal theory that multiple federal appellate courts have affirmed, and there's a healthy debate at law school over. I mean, that's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at something that, as Senator Warren laid out, is an affront to how Congress has chosen to operate the financial sector across a range of agencies for good reason that are going to really be drawn home in the next few days when we see what happens when the government does shut down. I mean, what would happen if all of these regulators could not operate as they are needed, as necessary? And so, I think that's a piece. And then you look at where the court fits in that, which is that this is really a separation of powers concern, that you have Congress, which very clearly Congress has to lay out how things get funded. That is part of the legislative process. But once it does, it is not the judiciary's role to roll that back. And so that's what you see with this very kind of radical theory that's made it up to the court, and the concerns are really broad.
Thank you, Skye. I want to now open up the floor for questions from our audience. One thing I do have to ask of you is that if you do have a question, raise your hand. Emma here, my colleague, has the mic. Please do wait till the mic gets to you so both folks in the room as well as those online can hear you properly. So we welcome questions. And if you are online, we also are taking online questions, so feel free to submit your questions there.
Hi, thank you all for the insight that you gave about the consumer financial protection and how it impacts consumers. My question is mainly on the comms side of things, is how would you advise on the communication side, especially on digital, to break this down? Because all of us here are very smart in this room, but kind of breaking it down for people to understand what the stakes are is also really important.
Thank you. May I also ask your name and affiliation, and of other questioners as well?
Yeah, Gus Duran. I work on the digital engagement side for Cap Action.
Thank you so much. Who would like to take that?
one thing you can do later today on our website at democracyforward.org, we do have a glossary and a guide coming out about how the people, it's democracy for the people at this court, because some of the cases, this is one of them. There are others actually, and we could maybe come back and talk about those. But some of the cases this term appear very technical, and it's about regulation and these words like administrative state. And this is really a term that's very high stakes for the real lives of people, but it's hard to understand. So we have some resources up. I know that you'll probably talk about some of the resources that you all have, but democracyforward.org, I know CAP will have resources, but I think there's various groups have come out with some explainers, and it is really important. I think you're also seeing, and there's been a number of folks speaking out about how concerning this is, how concerning it is for other agencies. There was just a op-ed this morning from a former head of the FDIC under a Republican administration that was warning about this. So I think harnessing some of those materials and making sure that's getting a broader audience could be very helpful as well.
I guess I would like to underscore the op-ed that came out this morning, and what AFR has been doing is a series of op-eds. One thing I will say is this is essentially about consumers. It's about judicial overreach. But on the consumer side, people need to know when they're being treated badly. And to express that to everyday people on your websites in plain language is necessary. Just like the medical debt proposed rule. How is this going to help consumers? People don't know that medical debt doesn't need to be on your credit report. They don't know that it's not indicative of credit worthiness. So those plain language terms is what we try to do on our consumer team at AFR, and opinion, education, and all of that is what we try to do as well.
Mike, anything to add?
Just that helping people take advantage of the CFPB is a great way to help people understand why this case matters. I mentioned before, 40 million people are going to start paying their student loans this month for the first time in 3.5 years. It's a mess. And people are getting bills for the wrong amount of money. They're having trouble getting their rights to affordable loan payments. And the CFPB is there. They're watching out, and they're making sure people's student loan companies respond to them and fix problems. So just be evangelists. Tell the story of the CFPB and help people that are in trouble with financial firms get help.
Thank you. We can take another question from the room. Again, name and affiliation would be helpful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jordan Haynes. I'm a Master of Policy Management candidate at McCourt School at Georgetown and a National Urban Fellow with the National Urban League. My question is regarding also communication about how we are getting this to consumers. Specifically at the National Urban League, I work with economic development for Black families, and it's very easy to recognize how Black individuals, Black households are very distrustful of institutions because these institutions have been systemically designed to be against them. So when we are talking about the Supreme Court, these cases that are obviously very imperative to their own, economic protections, how do you mention that? How do you take that in consideration for, to Elise's point, individuals who have historically had their wealth extracted? What are the communication practices that you would take into account to ensure that people understand they should be mobilized to to access their power in this regard?
I think what we kind of just said. Consumers, especially, we see that a lot of the financial mistrust comes from a disproportionate effect on Black and brown households because of the wealth extraction. And I think explaining that in ways that are not trigger words like, low income and Black and brown people, and making those things synonymous, although they do correlate, gives a sense of power to Black and brown people that this is not from lack of education or lack of, mismanagement of finances. It's a systemic thing that has been happening, and this is the ripple effect of that systemic thing. So painting that picture for Black and brown folks, giving them their power back and not taking it away by calling them low income and making that synonymous is essential in telling that story. And I would just urge the National Urban League to do that.
I think and you see this in your work every day, but one of the major tools that systems use and that this very far right movement uses, and that is to deprive people of any sense of hope. This has already been written, it's already been done, you know, CFPB is going to fall, you know, those things. At the fundamentally, our obligation and our work is to use our power to make that not the case. And so we're going to see what the Supreme Court does. And there have been many people weighing in. I would say that like there are hopeful places here, which is that you have people that are going to be held. They're going to be asking the questions, holding people to account. And I think, you know, really trying to, it's hard in this era of there's so much to doom scroll about, and there's always been so much. There is hope in the mobilization. This is going to be on the docket in the middle of a major election year where people are going to be making decisions about the types of people that get to appoint judges, about the types of people that get to pass these policies. And so I think that is something that when we work with communities, also emphasizing we've seen has been helpful. It's not just that you go to the Supreme Court and then it's over the next day, right? I mean, there's power that is harnessed and hope.
All right, let's take a couple questions from online. I believe we have some.
Sure. So we have a short but timely question from Metal News Services. Do you think an agency like the CFPB can be trusted to be funded by Congress given its current state with the imminent government shutdown?
Who would like to take that one?
I'll take a
Go
shot
ahead.
at it. No. The not glib answer is I think that you know for more than 100 years, Congress has recognized in its own independent judgment that insulating financial regulators from the appropriations process, from the political process, is good for the stability of our markets.
Anyone else? I think it looks like we can't trust Congress to fund anyone or anything these days, but welcome other thoughts.
Could you repeat the question, Lilith?
Do you think an agency like the CFPB can be trusted to be funded by Congress given its current state with the imminent government shutdown?
Well, Congress already decided how the CFPB was going to be funded, and to now use the courts to then kick it back to Congress to do exactly what they've already done is kind of asinine. So again, they've already decided how the CFPB should be funded. And I think, you know, this Congress, no, you know, given what we are facing next week, but we've already gone down this road.
Thanks, Liz. That's a great point that, you know, there is a funding mechanism and there is a reason why it is not part of the annual appropriations. And that's really key to the independence of the agency. Next question.
So we have another one from online, and this is directed to Skye, but welcome others. Another case coming before the court that could have far-reaching implications is Moore versus US. Do you see Moore as part of the same trend using novel legal theories to undermine congressional prerogatives? Are there other cases we should have our eyes on in the next SCOTUS session?
It's a great question. So Moore versus United States is a case that is challenging longstanding authority under the longstanding authority with respect to taxation and with respect to the taxation of unrealized gains. It's actually a challenge to the tax cuts that the Trump administration championed. So just to be very clear about how far right we're talking about here, this is a group that is challenging a tax bill and tax program and tax cuts that were actually championed by the prior administration in order to try to eliminate a core principle of our taxation system that could be that is very impactful and has a lot of implications for wealth taxes, corporate taxation systems, and others. I do think that this is a clear example of another incredibly bizarre and far right legal theory that is moving through the courts. I think that you'll likely see, the briefs will come in soon, but I expect that you will likely see a really interesting collaboration and coalition of people weighing in favor of the United States in that case, and against this attack, including more traditionally conservative voices. I don't know that you'll see that across the board, but I watched who starts weighing in, because this is really something that, again, like things that we used to maybe take for granted, are pretty foundational to how our government operates. That underscores for the entire term that this is a term where really the ability of our government to deliver for people is at stake, and there are groups that are seeking to undermine that. Other cases to watch is a case called Loper Bright, which is seeking to potentially overturn almost 4 decades of precedent with respect to how federal agencies operate and the way that federal agencies and the powers they have to be able to interpret laws and carry out the work that Congress asked them to carry out. And so again, these are they seem technical, they seem wonky. They're going to have tremendous impact on the lives of everyday people. I encourage you to use the resources CAP, AFR, Democracy Forward, and others will be providing to be able to learn and understand and talk about these cases and to build power, whether that is through weighing in at the court and weighing in on these things in communications in the media, or whether that is building power to hold our lawmakers and our policymakers accountable in the days ahead. But it's a high stakes term for people and the ability of government to be able to deliver for people.
So part of this term is next week, and this case is being heard on Tuesday. So I want to ask you in closing, one last question. If you can be brief, I'd appreciate it. But when you listen to those oral arguments next week in CFPB or CFSA and read about it, what one thing will you be monitoring as you think about what's being argued before the court? Let's start with you, Mike, and then Sky, and then Elise.
So this case, particularly with Loper Bright following right behind it, is the first real challenge that we've seen with the 6-3 court to government's ability to work for people. So I'm watching the questions that come from the potential swing justices here, Kavanaugh and the chief, to see just how far they're going to want to go to prevent government from working for people. This is a really radical legal theory being advanced here, and how seriously the so-called moderate middle of this court, of this really extreme court, takes these arguments, I think will give us a sense of what's going to come to.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Sky?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be looking for the questions they ask, and again, how this court contends with a legal theory that has been really sort of crafted in order to just promote a special interest. I think that there is reason the court as an institution, its legitimacy and institution as an institution is, on the line in these cases where these are very radical legal theories. Courts exist to be able to promote the rule of law for everyone and to be predictable. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the justices contend with this.
Elise?
I'll be listening for lines of questioning that kind of try to insulate, no pun intended, the CFPB and make it its own thing, saying that it's double insulated and no other entity is like it, to see where the justices' heads are and try to anticipate some type of opinion next year.
Well, Mike Pierce, Sky Perryman, Elise Hicks, thank you so much for being on our panel today to discuss the future of the CFPB and how we can protect its integrity and effectiveness to protect consumers. Thank you also again to Senator Warren and Patrick Gaspard, our president and CEO, for being part of this event. And we will stay tuned to figure out what will happen with the court next week and how we go forward from there. Thank you all so much.